You know what nobody tells you about NASCAR's stock car racing in the 1960s? That the most powerful engine ever built for it never turned a single lap in competition. I'm talking about Ford's 427 SOHC, the Cammer, the engine that was so absurdly overpowered, so technically advanced, so pants-wettingly fast that NASCAR banned it before it could embarrass everyone else. Never heard of it? What if I told you Ford built a 657 horsepower naturally aspirated engine in 1964? What if I told you it had overhead cams when everyone else was still figuring out push rods? What if I told you it was banned not because it cheated, but because it was too good? The Cammer has always fascinated me. I'm not entirely sure why, to be honest. Maybe because it represents peak insanity in American motorsport, when winning mattered more than profit and engineers were given blank checks to build the impossible. Maybe because it's proof that Detroit could out-engineer anyone when properly motivated. Or maybe because underneath all that exotic valve train was pure spite converted into mechanical energy. 90 feet of timing chain? Yes, 90 feet. Not a typo. 90 feet of chain driving overhead cams in an era when overhead valves were considered fancy. So with that out of the way, let's rewind to 1963. Richard Petty is dominating NASCAR in his Plymouth. Chrysler has just unveiled their 426 Hemi, and it's destroying everything. Ford's 427 wedge engine, which was no slouch at 425 horsepower, is getting its doors blown off. The Hemi is making 425 horsepower too, officially, but everyone knows it's actually making closer to 500. Ford is losing races, losing sales, and Henry Ford Sr. is losing his mind. Something has to be done. The order comes down from Henry II himself. Beat Chrysler. Cost is no object. Time is no object. Just win. The engineers at Ford's engine and foundry division look at each other and probably think, well, he asked for it. They could have just built a better wedge head. They could have copied Chrysler's hemispherical combustion chamber. Instead, they decided to build something that had never been attempted in American V8s at this scale. Single overhead cams. Now check this out. The development timeline was insane. From concept to running engine in less than 90 days. 90 days! Modern car companies take longer to design a cup holder. They started with the existing 427 FE block because designing a new block would take too long. But everything else? Revolutionary. The heads were completely new castings with ports the size of sewer pipes. The cam towers were aluminum. The cams themselves were hollow steel tubes with lobes welded on. This wasn't evolution, it was revolution with a sledgehammer. The valve train. Oh my God, the valve train. Each bank had its own camshaft sitting directly on top of the valves. No push rods, no rocker arms, just cam lobes actuating valves through finger followers. Simple in concept, nightmarish in execution. The cams were 6 feet away from the crankshaft. How do you drive them? Gears? Too noisy. Belts? They didn't exist in materials that could handle the load. Chains? Chains it is. But here's where it gets interesting. Or insane. Maybe both. The timing chain setup required an idler sprocket halfway up the block to keep tension. The chain went from the crank, up to the idler, up to the cam, across the cam, back down to another idler, and back to the crank. 6 feet of chain, per bank, plus a connecting chain between the cams to keep them synchronized. Total chain length, 90 feet. I mean, come on, that's not a timing chain. That's a bicycle shop. The first dyno pull was eventful. With a single 4-barrel carburetor and conservative tuning, it made 616 horsepower at 7,000 RPM, 616, naturally aspirated, on pump gas. Well, 1960s pump gas, which was basically racing fuel, but still. The Chrysler Hemi guys must have needed new underwear when they heard those numbers. Ford knew they had something special. They also knew it was too special. NASCAR had rules about engines being production-based. You had to sell them to the public, theoretically. Chrysler was selling Hemis, barely, at huge losses, just to legalize them for racing. Ford would have to do the same with the Camry. The problem? Each engine cost about $2,000 to build in 1964. That's $20,000 today. For just the engine, no car, just engine. Furthermore, the Camry was not exactly streetable. It idled at 2,000 RPM. It sounded like someone throwing hammers into a washing machine. The valve train was so noisy you couldn't hear the radio. Not that you'd want a radio because the vibration would shake your teeth loose. The chain drive needed adjustment every 500 miles. It was basically a race engine that Ford claimed could be used on the street if you were clinically insane. NASCAR's Bill France took one look at the Camry and basically said, absolutely not. His official reason was that it wasn't a production engine. Ford countered that they would sell it to anyone who wanted one. France said it was too exotic. Ford pointed out that Chrysler's Hemi wasn't exactly a grocery getter either. France said the rules required wedge heads. Ford's lawyers noted the rules said no such thing. What followed was the most expensive temper tantrum in motorsports history. Ford threatened to pull out of NASCAR entirely. They had just spent millions developing the Camry and millions more on their racing program. France wouldn't budge. Ford actually did pull out, sitting out most of the 1965 season. Imagine that today. Like Chevrolet just deciding not to race because they're mad at the rules. Meanwhile, the Camry found other places to dominate. Drag racing welcomed it with open arms. And by welcomed, I mean watched in horror as it destroyed every record. Mickey Thompson put one in his Mustang Funny car. It ran 8.91 seconds at 180 mph. In 1965, Connie Kalita's Camry-powered dragster was hitting 200 mph when topped. Fuel cars with nitromethane were struggling to break 190. The technical specifications were pornographic for gearheads. Bore and stroke, 4.23 x 3.78 inches for 427 cubic inches. Compression ratio, up to 12.5.1 in race trim. Valve sizes, 2.25 inch intake, 1.90 inch exhaust. Port volume, massive enough to stick your fist in. The power band was from 3,000 to 8,000 RPM, though it would spin to 9,000 if you were brave or stupid. Usually both, but it wasn't just about peak power. The Camry had a broader torque curve than the Hemi. It made more power everywhere from 4,000 RPM up. It was lighter than the Hemi by almost 100 pounds, despite the complex valve train. It had better head flow, better combustion chamber design, better everything. It was what happened when you gave talented engineers unlimited resources and a specific target to destroy. The sound was unlike anything else, not the lumpy idle of a big cam pushrod engine or the rasp of a small block. It was a smooth, mechanical whir overlaid with the clatter of chains and the whoosh of massive volumes of air. At full throttle, it sounded like the world ending. Drag racers said you could hear a Camry car coming from a mile away. Different, angry, expensive sounding. You know what's particularly interesting? Ford kept developing it even after the ban. They built a version with Hillborn fuel injection that made 675 horsepower. They experimented with dual overhead cams, though that never made it past the prototype stage. They created aluminum versions that weighed less than a modern LS3. They were basically showing off at this point, building engines that would never race just to prove they could. The mythology around the Camry grew because so few people actually saw one race. It became this unicorn engine that may or may not have been as powerful as claimed. Ford said 657 horsepower. Chrysler said impossible. Independent dyno tests were all over the map because nobody could afford to buy one just to test it. The mystery added to the legend. Some racers tried to sneak Camrys into NASCAR. They'd claim it was a wedge head with unusual valve covers. Tech inspectors weren't stupid though. The sound alone gave it away. That chain drive had a distinctive whine that no pushrod engine could replicate. Plus, the valve covers were 2 feet tall. Kinda hard to miss. The production numbers were tiny. Ford built maybe 250 complete engines total. They sold them through their performance parts catalog for $1.95. In 1965, you could buy a complete Mustang for $20,500. The take rate was, unsurprisingly, minimal. Most went to professional drag racers who could afford them and actually needed that much power. The survival rate is actually pretty good because they were too valuable to throw away. When a camera expired, and they did expire spectacularly when those chains let go, racers would rebuild them rather than scrap them. Today, an original camera engine sells for six figures. A complete, documented race engine can break $200,000. That's Ferrari money for a Ford engine that never won a NASCAR race. The influence on Ford's racing program was profound. The fury over the camera ban led directly to the GT40 program. If NASCAR wouldn't let them race their super engine, they'd go embarrass Ferrari at Le Mans instead. That worked out pretty well. 4 consecutive Le Mans wins. Total domination of international sports car racing. All because Bill France said no to an engine. Here's what really gets me though. NASCAR claimed to be about stock cars, production vehicles that anyone could buy. But the Camry was more production-based than half the stuff that was actually racing. You really could buy one from Ford. You really could put it in your street car if you were insane. It used a production block. It was more stock than the tube-frame purpose-built race cars with manufacturer stickers that NASCAR runs today. The real reason for the ban was obvious to everyone. It would have made Chrysler's Hemi obsolete overnight. It would have required every other manufacturer to develop overhead cam engines to compete. It would have started an arms race that would have made racing even more expensive than it already was. France banned it not because it was illegal, but because it was too legal, too good, too far ahead. Ford's engineers had basically solved racing. They'd built an engine that couldn't be beaten with existing technology. The only way to beat a Camry would be to build a better Camry, and nobody else had the resources or knowledge to do that in 1964. It would have been Ford versus Ford for the championship. Boring for spectators, expensive for competitors, bad for the sport. But man, what could have been? Imagine a full season of Camry-powered Galaxies battling Camry-powered Fairlanes. The development race would have been incredible. We might have seen dual overhead cams, 4-valve heads, variable valve timing, all in the 1960s instead of the 1990s. The Camry could have accelerated engine development by decades. Instead, NASCAR stuck with push rods. Still uses them today, actually. The current NASCAR Cup engines are pushrod V8s, making about 670 horsepower from 358 cubic inches. It took them 50 years to match what the Camry did in 1964 with 60 more cubic inches. Progress, sort of. The Camry's legacy in drag racing is undeniable, though. It proved that overhead cams could work in American V8s. It showed that there was power beyond what pushrods could deliver. It inspired a generation of engine builders to think beyond traditional designs. Every import tuner with a DOHC 4-cylinder owes something to the Camry, proving the concept could work here. Modern Ford performance engineers still reference the Camry. When they developed the Voodoo flat plane crank 5.2 for the GT350, they studied the Camry's valve train. When they built the Cheez EcoBoost V6, they looked at the Camry's development timeline as inspiration. It's become this touchstone of what's possible when you remove constraints. Some people today build replica Camrys. Robert Pond Racing will build you a brand new one for about $50,000. They're actually better than the originals with modern metallurgy and manufacturing tolerances. They're still completely insane though. Still 90 feet of timing chain. Still impossible to live with on the street. Still magnificent. I've seen exactly one running Camry in person at a drag race in Michigan. The owner fired it up in the pits and every single person within 100 yards stopped what they were doing and walked over. The sound is indescribable. Mechanical violence, organized chaos. It's what I imagine a tornado sounds like from inside. When he revved it, car alarms went off 3 rows away. The guy let me look under the valve covers, and it's just pornographic. The cams are these massive tubes with aggressive lobes. The springs are the size of beer cans. The followers look like they could double as hammers. Everything is overbuilt because it has to be. At 8,000 RPM, those valves are opening and closing 66 times per second. The forces involved are astronomical. What strikes me most about the Camry is the ambition of it. Ford didn't just try to beat the Hemi, they tried to obsolete it. They didn't want to win races. They wanted to end competition. They built an engine so advanced that the sanctioning body had to ban it to preserve the sport. That's not just winning. That's winning so hard they changed the rules. Modern racing has nothing like this. Everything is regulated to the nth degree. Displacement limits, RPM limits, boost limits, everything limited. The idea of building something so powerful it gets banned just doesn't happen anymore. The closest we've seen recently was Toyota's restricted turbo in WRC that illegally bypassed the restrictor. But that was cheating. The Camry wasn't cheating, it was just too good. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if France had let them run. Would Ford have dominated for a year or two until everyone caught up? Would overhead cams have become standard in American V8s? Would we have seen 1,000 horsepower naturally aspirated engines by the 1970s? We'll never know. Alternative history is pointless speculation, but it's fun speculation. The real tragedy of the Camry isn't that it was banned. It's that it represented the end of an era. The era when winning mattered more than anything. When engineers were given blank checks to build the impossible. When innovation was rewarded rather than regulated. After the Camry, everything in racing became about restriction rather than expression. Today's NASCAR engines are marvels of engineering, but they're all essentially the same. Same displacement, same configuration, same power, same everything. They're closer to spec engines than pure competition. The Camry was the last time someone built something genuinely different, genuinely better, genuinely revolutionary for NASCAR. And they were punished for it, but in a weird way, being banned made the Camry immortal. If it had raced and won for a few years, it would just be another successful racing engine, a footnote in history books, some black and white photos of victory lane. Instead, it became legendary, the engine that was too powerful for NASCAR, the motor that scared Bill France, the lost superweapon of the horsepower wars. Every time someone claims they built something too powerful for competition, the Camry is the standard. Every time a sanctioning body bans superior technology, the Camry is the precedent. Every time an engineer goes too far, builds too well, succeeds too much, the Camry is the cautionary tale, or inspiration, depending on your perspective. The Camry proved that American engineers could build world-class engines when motivated. It proved that Detroit wasn't just about cheap horsepower, but could do sophisticated as well. It proved that sometimes the best engineering solution is the one that gets you banned, because if you're not getting banned, are you really trying? In the end, the 427 SOHC was too powerful for NASCAR, not because of its horsepower, though that was prodigious. It was too powerful because it represented change, and NASCAR didn't want change. It wanted close racing with familiar technology that fans could understand and manufacturers could afford. The Camry threatened all of that. It was too good, too expensive, too different, too everything. Ford spent roughly $10 million developing the Camry. They sold maybe $500,000 worth of engines. By any business measure, it was a complete failure. But by any engineering measure, it was a complete success. They built the most powerful, naturally aspirated engine of the era. They proved overhead cams could work in American V8s. They showed that Detroit could innovate when it wanted to. The shocking truth about the Camry isn't that it was banned. Everyone knows that. The shocking truth is that NASCAR was probably right to ban it. It would have destroyed the sport as it existed. It would have turned stock car racing into Formula One, where only manufacturers with 9-figure budgets could compete. It would have ended the career of every independent racer who couldn't afford exotic overhead cam engines. But knowing they were right doesn't make it any less frustrating. watching NASCAR choose mediocrity over excellence, tradition over innovation, politics over performance. The camera represented the road not taken, the future that wasn't, the timeline where American V8s evolved instead of stagnated, where pushrod engines died in the 1960s instead of lingering to today. Every time I see a modern DOHC V8 from Ferrari or McLaren making 200 horsepower per liter, I think about the camera. Ford was doing 150 horsepower per liter in 1964 with carburetors on pump gas with 1960s metallurgy. Imagine what they could have done with 50 more years of development. We'll never know because NASCAR chose tradition over evolution. The camera was too powerful for NASCAR, not because of what it was, but because of what it represented. Change, evolution, obsolescence of the established order. It was too powerful because power isn't just about horsepower. It's about the power to change things. And that's the one thing racing's governing bodies never want to allow. The camera had to be banned not because it was illegal, but because it was too legal, too possible, too real. That's the shocking truth. The camera wasn't banned for being too powerful. It was banned for being too right. And in racing, like in life, being too right is sometimes the worst thing you can be.